Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this second part of this read-through of The Story of Art Without Men by Katie Hessel. A wonderfully insightful book into the history of art, where Katie Hessel is addressing the absence of women in formal art history literature. And our second part today takes a look to a heroic past of the 18th century. And of course the 18th century is full of advancements artistically and stylistically, but also for the position of women. So records show us that nearly 300 women artists worked professionally in Europe, many miniaturists, engravers, portraitists, and some reached new heights of fame. A few women of this era broke ground with complex history paintings and sophisticated portraits. So we have the period of Rococo and Neoclassicism. So following the death of Louis XIV in 1715, the long-ruling king who favoured a glorified Baroque style, the French court, now under the rule of the new boy, Louis XV, migrated from the grand palaces of Versailles to the city of Paris, which prompted a demand for an art style that could serve the new urban aristocracy, the Rococo. So going against the splendour and majestic formality of before, Rococo is famed for its ornate opulence, asymmetrical curvilinear lines, scroll-like forms, spanning architecture to the decorative arts. The painters of this style sought to capture charming everyday subject matter with a focus on the individual. So prior to the height of this popularity in the 1730s, a young Venetian artist, Rosalba Carriera, was already working in a manner that anticipated the Rococo's elegance and lightness. Here's François-Marie de Bourbon as Amphitrite. She was acclaimed for shimmering pastel works that not only contributed to the shift in aesthetic following her influential visit to Paris in 1720, but she was instrumental in pioneering the pastel portrait. Dubbed the Queen of Pastel during her lifetime, she's the most successful female artist in her lifetime in Europe. She was born into a middle-class family. Her mother was a lace maker, her father a civil servant. She was raised in Venice, the eldest of three sisters. She was, in the early 1700s, earning a living painting portrait miniatures onto ivory for the inside of snuff boxes. And with her fast-growing international clientele, she began to experiment with pastel crayons for her portraits, which is an unusual medium at the time because they were usually reserved for sketching or copying. But her work pushed it into the realm of high art, and this is a portrait here of a young lady with a parrot. I mean, if that's pastel work, that is absolutely sensational, isn't it? There's volume and life in the hair, the pose, there's such energy. One thing that I've seen in common with a lot of the female artists' work of this book so far is just the sheer energy, the kinetic energy that has been captured by them, so that these images are really coming to life. She portrayed high-ranking aristocracy and wealthy merchants, often sporting silvery locks and translucent ruffs, and her painterly use of pastel was perfect for Rococo. Because of the way it dried, she could finish her portraits quickly, and her sister filled in the backgrounds, so it was a bit of teamwork. And because she was working on paper, the portraits were easily transportable. And after being persuaded to by an influential art collector to visit Paris, she arrived in the city in 1720 and was met with nothing but praise. The revered French Rococo painter Jean-Antoine Watteau became a fan. She was commissioned to portray the then 10-year-old Louis XV. She made a lasting impression on the ruling classes, who appreciated her distinctive artistic style, granted her an honorary membership to the Académie Royale in Paris, and she went on to be elected at the Accademia Santa Clementina in Bologna to travel extensively across Europe. She continued to excel in pastel. This wonderful painting this portrait, not a painting of course, it's pastel, that we looked at earlier, and the 18th century art dealer Pierre-Jean Mariette claimed her images came from heaven. In Venice, she spent her final years in the grip of depression, triggered by the death of her sister Giovanna and her fading eyesight. That's a sad final chapter. Rococo was eclipsed by the rise of neoclassicism and the negative gendered associations with the Rococo had with femininity. So, by the time of the 1789 French Revolution, the style had run its course and Carrera was forgotten. So the second half of the 18th century marked the rise of neoclassicism, which abhorred all things Rococo and looked towards a glorified ancient past. Of course, we have a big shift in French politics, starts looking at more ancient Roman and mythological influences. A child prodigy who spoke 5 languages and excelled at music, Angelica Kauffmann was celebrated for her stunningly executed portraits and history paintings. An artist full of determination, she pushed gender boundaries as a member of prestigious art academies in Rome, Bologna and Florence, earned respect and infatuation from her male peers by the end of the 1700s. Kauffmann was considered one of Europe's leading painters, and a contemporary engraver of hers once remarked, "The whole world is Angelica mad." She was born in Switzerland, and received artistic training from her painter father. Spent her youth travelling across Europe, tracking down patrons and admiring and copying Renaissance works. By 12 or 13, her painting skills were exemplary, as seen by the technically dazzling rosy-cheeked self-portrait with a sheet of music in 1753, demonstrating both musical and artistic pursuits. In London, when she arrived in 1766, another artistic capital of neoclassicism due to the taste of the reigning King George III, the financially savvy Kauffmann set up a studio on Golden Square, where she was known to charge the same price as her male contemporaries. She quickly rose up the ranks, and within just 2 years became one of 2 female founding members of the Royal Academy of Arts, the other one being the English botanist painter Mary Moser. But despite holding prestigious titles, Moser and Kauffmann were banned from proper training, access to the life room, and important meetings, which is outrageous if you're the founding member of an academy. A particularly savage move by the male academians was when the women were portrayed alongside the founding 36 members in an official portrait by Johann Zoffany, the academians of the Royal Academy. And instead of painting them as figures, like the string of confident men who all surround a nude model, Moser and Kauffmann were merely and almost unrecognisably immortalised as portrait busts, as visible in the top right-hand corner. So they're not even allowed to be physically in the room. Despite that cruelty, she continued to produce ambitious multi-figured paintings. How she was able to paint such ambitious compositions. I mean, at the Royal Academy she was commissioned to create 4 ceiling roundels honouring the 4 elements of art in the form of allegories: colour, composition, invention and design. This one's design. She portrays a female artist studying from the Belvedere torso, which is a muscular body cast and a substitute for a male life model. And in drawing attention to the ways Kauffmann got around her exclusion from the life room, design shows both the capabilities of women and the limits which they had to abide. So although Moser's and Kauffmann's senior positions appeared to show women entering new spaces, nothing changed for decades, a century even. It was until 1860 for the next female artist to be admitted to the Royal Academy. And Laura Herford only got in by submitting drawings by using her initials, LH. And until the 1890s, for women to be allowed to study from the nude, the first official female Royal Academician was elected in 1936, Laura Knight. And to date in 2022, only 9.3% of royal academicians have been women. It has a lot of work to do, like many institutions. But back to the 18th century, this time in France. So the French Revolution. Big time, of course. And some women achieved meteoric success, taking up prime positions at the Paris Salon, admitted to the Académie Royale, despite the 4-women cap. Their success was in part due to the glittering array of female royal clientele, who no doubt appreciated their ability to capture a handsome portrait. A favourite of the ruling Queen Marie Antoinette was Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. She was born in Paris, trained briefly by her pastel portraitist father, who died when she was 12. Vigée-Lebrun was for the most part self-taught and highly ambitious. By 15, she was her family's sole earner, and within a few years was married off to high society art dealer. He introduced her to the Parisian cultural elite, but his job meant she could access, copy and study the most important paintings of the day. And commended by patrons for her soft textures and desirable portraits, which made her sitters appear slightly more attractive than in reality. She's a 1700s Instagram filter. In 1778, Vigée-Lebrun caught the attention of Marie Antoinette and struck up a close relationship. Until the arrest, of course. And here is Marie Antoinette in a chemise dress, straddling both the opulence of the Rococo and the order of neoclassicism for her radiant paintings. Vigée-Lebrun, a devout royalist who enjoyed the life of the elite and embraced the era of pre-revolutionary France, was a master at grand hats and hairstyles, brought in to soften the infamous perception of the Queen at a politically tense time. She portrayed Marie Antoinette in a range of scenes, not all of which were well received. This is evident by this one here. She has a dress held together by a yellow bow, which was designed by her dressmaker Marie-Jeanne Bertin, and when exhibited at the Paris Salon of the same year, it caused great commotion due to the dress's resemblance of an undergarment, which was highly inappropriate for the time. It was immediately removed by the authorities, but it sparked a new movement in fashion, with women all over Europe abandoning elaborate robes for casual dress. And she knew how to work her own advantage. There was a time when Rousseau's view was on women and motherhood were popular among all social classes, and with the revolution on the horizon, Vigée-Lebrun was tasked with framing her patron as a doting mother, an example being Marie Antoinette and her children, a painting whose purpose was to portray the Queen as relatable, albeit in a illustrious crimson velvet gown and accompanying extravagant hat. Despite her being a supporter of the revolution, another court favourite was Adelaide Labille-Guiard, who preferred a muted palette and excelled at encapsulating an incredibly lifelike naturalism. Here's her self-portrait with two pupils. Wonderful lighting, fantastic shadows cast in this painting. She's best known as an advocate for women's artistic education. She was a teacher to many, as depicted here with two students appearing in full admiration of their lavishly dressed teacher, who's effortlessly tackling a giant canvas in front of her. It's documenting that influential status women artists had as teachers, and monumental size and stunning execution alluded to the scale of women's achievements in the pre-revolutionary period. So when the revolution struck, Vigée-Lebrun immediately fled France, living in exile for 12 years with her young daughter. And travelling across Europe, she earned favour with equally important upper-class patrons, amassing a considerably high salary. But when she returned to France in 1801, she found a very different culture from the one she left, recalling, "Women reigned then. The revolution dethroned them." Labille-Guiard stayed in France, but her career never again reached the heights of the 1780s. So the French Revolution saw the monarchy overthrown and political structures redefined, and the era proved contradictory for women. In the 1790s, the academies were dismantled due to their associations with aristocracy and refounded, yet women artists still faced educational restrictions. One aspect of the refounded academies was that they allowed for non-academician artists to exhibit, which saw a influx of middle-class female artists submitting to the Paris Salon. And one artist who earned acclaim in post-revolution Paris was Marie-Guillaume Benoit, a former pupil of Roger Lebrun. She had some success in the 1790s with genre paintings and pastels, but her fame soared after she exhibited a portrait of Madeleine at the 1800s Paris Salon. Madeleine's depicted in a dazzling white fabric tied with a red ribbon, sitting with elegance and poise in a chair covered with a rich blue shawl, and the colours are evocative of the French tricolour. Her portrait was painted 6 years after France abolished slavery in its territories, before it was reinstated by Napoleon in 1802, and scholars have suggested that it speaks of the newfound liberty in France for those previously enslaved. It's been compared to Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, made 30 years later, which also exposes the right breast of the protagonist and has a red ribbon tied around Liberty's waist. Here is the image here. That is stunning. Star colours. So it was originally Portrait d'une Négresse. The work was rightfully renamed Portrait of Madeleine. Prior to Marol's research, others have criticised the lack of attention to the identity of the sitter, which is a contentious issue throughout much of art history, which has seen black sitters' identity stripped. Marol adds, although the model is portrayed as emblematic of liberty, she can be assumed to have little or no ability to influence the manner of her portrait, confirming that black people were regularly utilised as symbols rather than individuals, which would have been the case if they'd been European. Another fantastic light image here, Marie-Denise Villiers. Marie-Joséphine Charlotte de Vallon. Lovely. So although the post-revolution years saw restrictions for women, Nochlin argues that women artists made progress as a group and as individuals, whether it's because of the less restricted access to the salons or the greater emphasis on portraits and genre rather than history painting. By 1835, 22.2% of exhibitors at the Salon were women, a 7.6% rise from 1801, and as we'll discover in the next chapter, more women were achieving great critical and financial success. So we're now moving from realism to spiritualism, to 1800s to 1900s. So the 19th century was revolutionary for women. Within 100 years, women in the West went from being barred from public education to having access to the most prestigious state-funded schools. And by the 1890s, this included the life room. Materials and processes were transformed, as was subject matter. And much of this was due to major changes to the political landscape. Of course, we had the French Revolution, the American Civil War, the abolishment of slavery, the beginnings of the suffrage movement, and it also marked one of the first times that women could succeed independently from men and speak up publicly for their rights. And by the end of the century, with symbolism, spiritualism, and as we discover in the following chapter, impressionism, artists were experimenting with styles so radical, so new, so revolutionary, that it would mark the dawn of what would become known as modern art. Here's a quote from Rosa Bonheur. "Why shouldn't I be proud to be a woman? My father told me again and again that it was a woman's mission to improve the human race. To his doctrines I owe my great and glorious ambition for the sex to which I proudly belong, whose independence I'll defend till my dying day. Besides, I'm convinced the future is ours." And realism remains one of the most influential movements of the 19th century, and still speaks to what artists make today. So one great realist artist was Rosa Bonheur, who was one of the most famous artists of the century, regardless of gender, and received the highest of accolades, such as the French Legion of Honor. Not only did she advance painting in subject and scale, but she transformed the perceptions of the modern woman in her spirit and style. She was born in Bordeaux, trained by her artist father, and spent her days sketching Dutch masters in the Louvre. Taking animals as a subject, Bonheur was so committed to her work that she observed cattle, dissected carcasses, even visited slaughterhouses to fastidiously study their anatomy. She was recognised at the Paris Salon at 19, and her first success was ploughing in the Nivernais, featuring weighty farm animals trudging through a quagmire and glittering in the sunlight. But the horse fair is where she really made her name. 5 meters high, 2 meters wide, which was at the time the largest painting devoted to the subject of animals. It captured a range of styles. Here's the horse fair here. Again, could you imagine seeing that in person? Absolutely huge. Again, wonderful energy. Demonstrating her extraordinary skills at capturing light, shade, energy, movement. Evident in the backdrop's imminent cloudburst, juxtaposed with the luminescent white light that hits the group of horses rapidly charging in a circular motion. She situates the viewer in the midst of the action. So this painting is so vivid, so lifelike, that when witnessed in the flesh, you can almost hear the hooves galloping across the earthy floor. It's considered one of the greatest works of its day by both critics and the general public, and it was requested by Queen Victoria for a viewing at Buckingham Palace, and with the emergence of new technologies, was widely reproduced in print. Determined to achieve acute precision, Bonheur spent nearly 2 years preparing for this work, visiting horse fairs on a bi-weekly basis, sketching every detail, recording every hair. But for a woman attending a male-dominated event, it wasn't an easy task. She was granted a permit by French authorities to wear masculine clothes, but this didn't bother her. She preferred to wear trousers. She called them great protectors, and was often portrayed proudly decked out in suits. And at a time when women were so constrained by societal norms, she was financially independent and internationally renowned, open about her relationships with women, such as the artist Anna Klumke, with whom she lived in a chateau complete with wild and farm animals. Realist detail and acute observation can also be found in the paintings of British artist Lady Butler, whose documentations of the Crimean War and the Battle of Waterloo exude a visceral spirit. She too defied conventions, working on a colossal scale and tackling subjects of war, which of course is usually the preserve of men. And unlike Bonheur's long-lasting fame, Butler's popularity was short-lived. Haven't heard of her, neither had the author until recently, but for a while she was the most famous female painter in Britain. Born Elizabeth Thompson, her obsession with battles began early, and she was drawing figures firing pistols at the age of 14. She was trained at the Female School of Art in South Kensington in London. Thanks to her parents' wealth, she was able to take additional classes privately, including drawing from the nude. She attracted some attention for her battle paintings, but it was in 1874 that her fame skyrocketed after she submitted calling the role after an engagement to Crimea to London's Royal Academy of Arts. Here it is, which is a vast painting depicting exhausted soldiers following a battle in the Crimean War. When it was publicly exhibited, it caused one of the greatest sensations that the Royal Academy had ever experienced. Crowds gathered, mile-long queues formed, security was brought in to control the punters who wanted to capture clips of anything they could. Immensely popular, it went on tour, and even Queen Victoria bid for the work and won. Like the horse fair, it was reproduced in prints, and critics couldn't believe that it was by a woman. And indeed, leading critic John Ruskin considered it an exception to his barbaric statement that no woman could paint. Come off it, John. So exactly why did this painting cause such a fuss? Not only were people shocked a woman could create such a work, but they were shaken by the psychological accuracy and intensity that Butler had recorded so perfectly. Unlike previous momentous and, to an extent, idealized battle paintings, the roll call depicted the soldiers' suffering, agony, sorrow, which illustrated Butler's stated intent of 1922, I never paint for the glory of war, but to portray its pathos and heroism. Despite nearly becoming the first female Royal Academy in the 19th century, losing out by 2 votes, her fame soon faded, and within years she was virtually unknown. Married, raising children, regularly posted around the world due to her husband's military career, she was ignored by critics who were dismissive and no doubt suspicious of work by a woman. But while it's vital we marvel at these women's successes, we should also question why they in particular receive such recognition. Are women only able to achieve greatness when they emulate successful men in style and subject matter, showing that they too can tackle bloody scenes and triumphal scales? And if we look at other female artists from this era and examine their strengths and innovations, should we not consider their work equal, worthy of praise and celebration? So from here, let us turn to artists who are just as deserving of such recognition, even though they're working on smaller scales, and some in alternative media from the traditional establishment. Quilt making. It's what historians often overlooked quilting as a key medium for far too long, no doubt in part as a hangover from the academies who dismissed embroidery as craft. Quilt making is important, not only artistically, but as a political tool and a medium which women have historically dominated. During the 19th century, quilting was practiced by many around the world, especially in America, whereas quilts in the early 1800s that still exist today have embroidered, intricate hand-woven elements, such as those in 1830s Baltimore. After the American Civil War and the rise of industrialism, with the abundance of mass-produced cloth and sewing machines, it was common for quilts to be pieced together and made by machine, so it was known as appliqué, applying multiple pieces of cloth to create a richly textured surface. Here's Emma Sivistad's Women's Rights quilt of 1875. So shown off at local and mainstream agricultural fairs where quilters often won prizes. They were made for many purposes: practical, educational, political, decorative, for warmth, wedding gifts, to raise money, awareness for abolitionist and feminist causes, such as the one we just saw, or for education and astronomical readings, as seen in the science teacher Ellen Harding Baker's mesmeric solar system quilt. That's lovely. That's wonderful. Quilts were also made to recall stories, such as the 2 remaining quilts by Harriet Powers, the most renowned quilt maker of the 19th century. It's telling a story of Christ, it looks like, the birth, the teachings, the crucifixion. So born into slavery in Georgia, it's thought that Powers, like most quilters, learned sewing from her family members, an accomplished African-American woman who could read and write, and a mother to 9 children. She received prizes for her narrative-driven quilts with complex cut-out and appliqué figures. With its rich, vivid textures and shapes of animals and angels and halos and ladders, the Bible quilt consists of 11 appliqué squares illustrating stories from the Old and New Testament. And honing her art even more on an ambitious scale, a few years later she made her most impressive work, the pictorial quilt. It comprises of 15 densely packed scenes that recount a mix of Bible stories and miraculous legends, featuring a range of meticulously cut out shapes and symbols, framed by dazzling strips of dotted fabric. So we see her not only recalling biblical tales such as Jonah and the whale here, but mystical tales of real-life events during and preceding her lifetime. So in the central square she notes the falling of the stars on November the 13th, 1833. The people were frightened and thought that the end had come. God's hand stayed the stars. The varmints rushed out of their beds, most likely referring to the spectacular Leonid meteor storm that saw between 50,000 to 150,000 meteors fall each hour. And far left in the bottom row, Cold Thursday, 10th of February 1895, a woman frozen while at prayer, a woman frozen at a gateway, all bluebirds killed, a man frozen at his jug of liquor, possibly referencing Florida's Great Freeze, as emphasized by the snow-like palette. So we can only imagine why she chose to document these tales, because we know her quilts were made for the purpose of being displayed as opposed to practicality. And aware of the merits of her art, in 1910, she signed her autobiography that "This I accomplish, Harriet A. Powers." But despite her impressive quilting abilities, she remained largely unknown to the public until the 1970s, when her work was rediscovered by feminists who, as we will see in Chapter 11, use the art of thread as a form of protest. And here we have working in 3 dimensions with pottery, which is again practiced in a variety of cultures, a global phenomenon, and virtually all communities have developed distinctive local traditions as a result of the differences in the availability of materials, firing processes, techniques. Perhaps the most well-known of Native American potters is the Hopi Tua artist Nampeyo, who was and continues to be celebrated for her ingenuity as a potter and designer. She was born in the village of Hano on First Mesa in northern Arizona, a Colorado Plateau community more than 1,000 years old. Like many Pueblo potters, Nampeyo learned her craft from family members, employed the coil and scrap technique, which was achieved by hand and sourced using mineral clay and paints from the surrounding area. Her pottery ranged from low, wide bowls to large everyday water vessels known as ollas and canteens that she painted with intricate figurative and at times geometric curvilinear designs. Here is a Polaka polychrome water jar. Wonderful design there and decoration. And her inspirations for these designs came primarily from encounters with shards of ancient pottery on old Hopi sites, including the first Mesa site, Sikyatki, which led to her work being described as Sikyatki Revival. She incorporated cat sinim imagery, which carries symbolic meanings, and in her work, cat sinim were mediators between Pueblo people and the spirit world. Her Polaka polychrome water jar, for instance, has 4 different cat sinim symbols. And suffering from vision problems for much of her life, in the end, Nampeyo lost her sight entirely. Assisted by her 3 daughters who painted her pottery, she passed down her innovative, pioneering approaches to her descendants, who are today continuing her legacy. And housed in museums all over the world, Nampeyo's work has been appreciated by millions and has influenced numerous other artists who have appreciated her bold approach to design. Working in marble, a wonderful medium, of course, best associated with, of course, ancient history, Rome and Greece et al. So we haven't encountered any sculptors working in marble so far, because the medium often required hard physical labour, prior anatomical training, a high price point for materials, meaning it was mostly limited to men. But in the mid-19th century, a group of female American sculptors who travelled to and worked in Rome began to construct medallions, busts, and life-size figures full of expression and charm. And in 1903, Henry James was to refer to them as the White Marmorean Flock. Harriet Goodhue Hosmer, Emma Stebbins, Margaret Foley, Anne Whitney, and Edmonia Lewis each represented a unique neoclassical aesthetic, drawing on both contemporary and classical subjects. They all have advanced technical ability, and a prominent member of the group was the great Edmonia Lewis, the first sculptor of African-American heritage of any gender to achieve such fame and recognition. Her stunningly chiseled marble busts and figurative sculptures, with their elegantly coiled hair, elastic-like folds of drapery, idealized nudes with robust builds, provided exceptional realism and character. There's one there, which was absolutely wonderful, Forever Free. 1867. Lewis was born to a Chippewa Indian mother who nicknamed her Wildfire, and a father of African descent in Greenbush, New York. She was orphaned at the age of 9 and was encouraged to study by her older brother Samuel, who funded her schooling at Oberlin College in the abolitionist town in Ohio. She enrolled in 1859 and studied Latin and Greek and experimented with drawing. She was popular among her peers. She faced racial discrimination, such as an instance when she was wrongly accused of stealing from her white roommates. Leaving Oberlin early in 1863, she headed east for Boston, where she was to thrive as a sculptor. She was part of Boston's progressive abolitionist circle, and witness to the city's monumental neoclassical sculptures. She was welcomed with open arms and briefly trained under a local sculptor, but it was her stone bust of a local abolitionist which earned her enough money to travel Europe, a decision made in part to escape the racial prejudice of America, and later told the New York Times in 1878, "The land of liberty had no room for a coloured sculptor." Arriving by boat in 1865, Lewis soon made her way to Rome. Inspired by the triumphant character of the Eternal City, she established a studio, experimented with marble, and developed her distinct neoclassical style. Most impressive was this one here, "Forever Free," referencing the Emancipation Proclamation of 4 years previously. It was originally titled "The Morning of Liberty." Its smaller than life-size yet weighty and mighty statuette immortalizes an empowered, freed African-American couple. Muscular and heroic on the right, we see a Herculean male figure breaking from his chains and rising a clenched fist. Protecting the figure on the left, an elegant, freed woman who kneels in prayer. Protection being an important symbol of the Emancipation Proclamation, her eyes are wide, her expression hopeful, as if she is looking forward to a promising future. So, fusing African-American narratives with the glorification of neoclassicism, Lewis broke ground for a new type of subject matter and would go on to be a major influence for artists just decades later, working in the Harlem Renaissance, in particular Make DeValvo, Warwick Fuller. And over in Japan, the Edo period of 1603 to 1868 was booming, a flourishing consumer culture where beautiful images were in high demand, from large-scale scroll paintings to woodblock prints and illustrated books. A variety of genres were popular in the period, most notably Kano school painting, literati painting, and ukiyo-e, images of the floating world, which were popular with the merchant classes. Ukiyo-e could be anything from hand-painted works on silk or paper to printed books showing everyday scenes, such as entertainment, landscapes, or courtesans working in the brothel quarters. In the 19th century, the great Katsushikoi was earning a great deal of recognition. Brought up in her father's workshop, immersed in ukiyo-e paintings and print designs, Oi displayed talents from an early age, and due to her circumstances, was able to fulfill her potential and pursue a prosperous professional and independent career. Marrying, and then divorcing, on the grounds it was rumoured that her husband's painting was not up to standard. That's funny. I returned to her father's studio, and no doubt got straight back to work. In the style of East Asian painting, Ai's calligraphic, intricate, sinuous lines are drawn with technical brilliance. She was a master at creating stark contrasts of light and dark shadows. Her use of glowing, saturated colour, together with the exquisite shading in her folded robes, is breathtaking. She was known to refer to a secret recipe for her innovative use of pigments, which saw her, as she recorded in a letter to a student, bury the material in the ground for around 60 days in order to achieve dazzling hues. But her bold subject matter also reveals a great skill for storytelling, and in particular, women-led narratives shown through a distinctly female lens. This is evident in the dramatic and highly atmospheric display room in Yoshisawa at night, showing courtesans trapped behind barred windows in the glare of a huge light. You can really see that stark colour there, can't you? It looks absolutely wonderful. The scene exudes melancholy. You could read into it a sympathy for the working women via the onlookers who, cloaked in the dark shadows of their lamps, eerily spy into the room. Many of Ai's images of women feel poignant and personal, in particular the exquisite girl composing a poem, Under the Cherry Blossoms in the Night. Wonderful light again, play with light and colour. Beneath a swirling starry night sky, surrounded by a rich texture of cherry trees and lit by the glow of a lantern, a woman is shown perhaps composing a poem, writing a letter, or drawing a picture, but the unusual and no doubt uncomfortable place for such an activity raises the question, could she be performing this in secret, as she strides out into the shadows of the night sky where nobody will find her? Although we can only speculate, the work reminds the author of the limitations faced by women writers and artists, not just in Japan, but across the globe. Following the death of her father, A's life fell into obscurity. Not even her death was recorded. Perhaps she was always dependent on him, but another unsurprising reason might be that she was the daughter of the most important Japanese ukiyo artist in history. Hokusai, famed for his remarkable print design under the wave off Kanagawa, nicknamed the Great Wave, she was being viewed in his shadow. That's a very famous Japanese painting, isn't it? You see it on t-shirts all the time. Ai was Hokusai's foremost collaborator and assistant, but nevertheless observing the masterful control of line and fineness of pigment that continued to characterize Hokusai's later paintings, which became enormously influential for European artists from 1870 onwards. Scholars are now debating just how much help she did provide towards the end of his life. Wouldn't be the first time that somebody takes on most of the work, would it? And in 1843, the British artist, floral illustrator and collector Anna Atkins broke new ground. She was to self-publish the first ever book featuring photographic images. In British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions, Atkins used the photographic process known as cyanotype to produce her distinctly dark blue-toned images, a technique used by fusing chemicals and applying them to photosensitive paper in a darkened room. Placing an item on top of the paper, exposing it to light, and in doing so she accomplished almost otherworldly, effervescent, detailed and to scale representations of botanical ferns and seaweeds. Here is Dictyota dichotama in the young state and in fruit from photographs of British algae. To the author, they feel equally ancient and futuristic, and given an illusion of something growing deep underwater. She was a trained botanist raised by her father of the same profession. Prior to her photographic book, she'd been a prolific illustrator and published over 250 drawings of shells. But despite her innovations and the 6,000 or so cyanotypes of flora and fauna she left behind, Atkins was largely ignored after her death until 1985, when her name resurfaced thanks to a reissuing of British Algae. We also have Victorian Britherton, the pre-Raphaelites in the Glasgow style. And we'll quote here from Joanna Boyce Wells. "I have a talent and the constant impulse to employ it, for the love of it and the longing to work, and no man has a right to say that is to be unheeded." In Britain, in the second half of the 19th century, this country was rife with artistic activity. The art market was expanding internationally, aided by the rise of technology in illustrated press prints, engravings, photographic reproductions. The increase of independent art dealers and critics, too, began to shape tastes and movements. So emerged a whole range of schools with different social and political outlooks. But the greatest changes were the growing freedoms for women, who protested for their rightful access to art education, and won. This was challenging male and female roles, particularly amongst the bourgeoisie. All the more since the prominent art critic John Ruskin had proclaimed, "The man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, creator, the discoverer. His intellect is for invention and speculation, but the women's intellect is not for invention or creation." So such an attitude made it difficult for British women to be taken seriously as professional artists. So taking matters into their own hands, they founded organisations, and at the dawn of the suffrage movement, slowly began to transform women's role in British society. So a great campaigner for women's suffrage, Emily Mary Osborne, used her paintings to critique the constant setbacks experienced by women, as evident in Nameless and Friendless. This is a painting centred on a Victorian woman who seems lost as she stands helplessly in an art dealer's shop. It's set up as a theatrical scene. Rain pours beyond the back windows. The two men on the left gaze at her with a sinister look, and the woman appears unwelcome by the dealer, who patronisingly inspects her picture. His judgmental expression affirms her lowly status in a male-dominated society and any possibility of taking her seriously as a professional. For a 21st century audience, this provides an insight into life as a Victorian woman by speaking to the injustices of the time. By the end of the century, much had changed. The establishment of the Slade Art School in the 1870s offered opportunities to female students on an equal basis to men. And after a petition in 1859 demanding the admittance of women artists as students to the prestigious Royal Academy of Arts, with Laura Herford admitted in 1860, by 1893 women were finally welcome in the Life Room. And by the mid-19th century Britain, a revolutionary group of artists emerged. Loosely referred to as pre-Raphaelites, the group rebelled against the slick academic aesthetic and indulged in startling colours and romantic jewel-like imagery. Mostly rejecting the increasingly conservative values of Victorian bourgeoisie society, they looked to alternative sources for inspiration. So, medieval art, pre-Raphael, modern art, great literature, Petrarch, Dante, and the Romantic poets, Keats and Wordsworth. They aimed to take art back to a time when its concerns were classicism, literature, poetry, scripture. So going against the era's convention of female beauty, artists of different sexes favoured as their subjects ethereal women with strong, striking features and long willowy hair. At the time, the images were criticised as grotesque and confrontational, but looking back now, they couldn't appear more modern. So, although it's often referred to as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, as the group was initially founded by 7 male poets in 1848, women played an active role within it. Not only did they sit for painters, influencing the male artists' imagery through their unique physical appearances, but they too were ambitious and professional artists. Elizabeth Siddal was an accomplished artist, famed for modelling for John Everett Millet's Ophelia, when she almost died, posing in a tin bath of ice-cold water, and as Beta Beatrix for her husband, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who posthumously immortalised her in a haunting transcendental glow. She was in fact full of determination, a world away from the victim-like blank-faced passive person documented by her male peers. Born into a working-class family, Siddal, fascinated by poetry since her youth, accessed the group via modelling. Began her artistic pursuits in 1852, was mostly self-taught, but some training from Rossetti, who installed in her his love of Gothic forms and medieval subjects. Siddal's watercolours often featured dreamlike, romantic, chivalrous scenes, but after suffering from depression, she died aged 32 from an overdose of laudanum. She'd only exhibited twice, and although Rossetti buried her with a book of his poems, 6 years after her death he requested for it to be exhumed from her grave. Oh, that's not very nice. A friend and contemporary of Siddal, Joanna Boyce Wells, was the most ambitious woman in the group. Born to a wealthy father who financed and encouraged her training in Paris. Unlike so many women, Boyce Wells was able to study anatomy, perspective, and the nude from life. Here's her Elgiva from 1855. Lovely pose there, lovely captured image. Sometimes considered too good by the group, Boyce Wells was a master at capturing her subject's sculptural three-dimensional physicality and inner psychological depth, as seen as the painting Overleaf. That painting was met with great praise when exhibited at the London Royal Academy of Arts, and John Ruskin no less aptly describing Elgiva's expression as so subtle, so tenderly wrought. And although the pre-Raphaelites are known for painting gaunt women with porcelain-like skin and long flowing hair, the author wants to spotlight Fanny Eaton, one of the most favoured and influential artist model of the era. Born a free woman in Jamaica, 1 year after slavery was finally abolished in the British colonies, Eaton arrived in London in 1851, and 1860 began her career as an artist model and was painted by numerous members of the group who captured her composure and beautiful high cheekbones. There she is. Beautiful. Boyce Wells' study portrays her with humility, intimacy, and psychological intensity. Like Elgiva, Eaton appears deep in thought, turned to the side, stands cloaked in a Grecian-style robe, wearing sparkling pearl earrings and a thin turquoise headband. It was intended as a study for a much larger painting, but it was to be Boyce-Wells' last work before her early death due to childbirth complications. Oh no. But working slightly later, the Anglo-Greek Marie Spartali-Stillman began her association with the Pre-Raphaelites as a model in the 1860s. The trailblazing photographer Julia Margaret Cameron captured her as a range of fictional subjects in a soft-focus lens, in line with the painterly aesthetics of her Pre-Raphaelite contemporaries such as Nemesis here. Interesting to start seeing photography. The portraits still feel so fresh and modern, they feel like they could have been taken today. And first working a camera at the age of 48, Cameron became known as one of the medium's pioneers and was instrumental in the development of portrait photography. She brought to it relaxed informality and intimacy, evidenced by her subjects' expressions or the visible lines on their faces. Stillman herself enjoyed a prosperous career, travelling extensively, selling her art successfully and exhibiting internationally. Referencing medieval poetry, mythological subjects, she used watercolours to achieve her luminous surfaces and intricate details of robes and embroidery. And appearing to challenge the role of women as object, the female characters in Stillman's watercolours are actively engaged, writing, reading, playing instruments, perhaps to highlight the talents in which women excelled. Here's a wonderful painting here of hers, The Enchanted Garden of Messer Ansaldo. Due to their generally wealthy backgrounds, most women in this chapter received private tutoring. So if we turn our attention to one of the first and finest examples of a woman who, working towards the end of the century, benefited from state-funded education. On the eve of her 17th birthday, Evelyn de Morgan wrote in her diary, 17 years wasted in eating, dawdling and frittering time away. Art is eternal, but life is short. I'll make up for it now. I have not a moment to lose. So rebelling against her parents' wishes, determined to be an artist, De Morgan enrolled at London's Slade School, one of their first ever female pupils. To be admitted to the Slade on an equal footing with her male counterparts proved a revolutionary opportunity, and for the first time, women in England were given access to free and comprehensive art education, including, most significantly access to the Life Room, albeit with a curfew of 5 p.m, praised for her studies of the nude, for which she was awarded prizes ahead of many of her male classmates. De Morgan had an astonishing way of depicting muscularity. Full of rigour and anatomical accuracy, she portrays rippling drapery with such sumptuousness that it glides seamlessly over her figures in almost breathable manner. So to achieve this, she drew studies of the same life poses with and without drapery. An active pacifist, feminist, campaigner for women's rights, having put her name to the Declaration in favour of women's suffrage of 1889, De Morgan imbued her work with deep political meaning. Considered one of her most impressive paintings, Night and Sleep of 1878 is an exuberantly rich and colourful work full of hidden feminist symbolism. Oh my. Let's just take a moment to enjoy this painting. I don't want the crease of the book down the middle of it. I want to go and see this image. The expressions, the flow of the drapery. Wonderful. So yes, it does evoke a bit of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. So she's included poppies, which is a popular Victorian sleeping remedy. Floating through an evening sky, the intertwined figures wrap a dusky cloak over themselves. And although it evokes the imminence of sleep, we could also interpret it as entering a new dawn, where the figure will awake to a world of equal gender rights, ready, like De Morgan, to make their mark. So as the century progressed, Pre-Raphaelites continued to weave signs and symbols into their work, and increasingly interested in the subconscious and the supernatural, they began looking to different sets of ideas, so emerged symbolism, away from the literal, and asceticism, celebrating beauty and art for art's sake. So this further coincided with artists beginning to abandon the hierarchies between art forms, and embracing their unity, the concept of creating a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, although not as prominently recognised in art history as the pre-Raphaelites. A group of Scottish artists associated with the Glasgow School of Art were just as pioneering, spearheading alternative ideas, which today seem more radical than ever. Foremost among them were sisters Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh and Frances MacDonald. The Glasgow style, as it was known, incorporated the values and utopian ideas of the arts and craft movement and the shared stylistic similarities with Art Nouveau and symbolism, moving away from the conventional representation and favouring bold, sinuous lines and elongated, distorted figures. Drawing inspiration from natural forms, illuminated manuscripts, Japanese woodblock prints and Celtic pagan art, these artists worked in myriad media: painting, architecture, furniture, metalwork, woodwork, stained glass. Around 75 of them are associated with the Glasgow School, including Jessie M. King, who designed wallpaper, jewellery, bookplates and textiles. But it was the Glasgow Four who accelerated the new style, the MacDonald sisters and their husbands. Frances and Margaret were formidable pioneers. Upon moving to Glasgow in 1890, they were among the first women ever admitted to the Glasgow School of Art, which was a school prized for promoting experimentation and for encouraging women to develop their artistic education, exhibit, and teach. Following their studies, the sisters established a studio on Hope Street, collaborating across all the arts. Lauded by artists and architects all over Europe, the Four's reputation was cemented after they created the interior of the Scottish rooms for the 8th Vienna Secession exhibition in 1900. They were praised for their Gesamtkunstwerk approach and MacDonald Mackintosh's giant Gesser-frieze, the May Queen. The frieze is in the top part of the wall here. So they've all designed this room. A panel of 5 exquisite female figures, rendered from strikingly dynamic, curvilinear lines. Greatly impressed. Tapping into the zeitgeist of the Viennese fin de siècle, with subtle three-dimensional elements swept up in architectural form, its thought artist Gustav Klimt was fascinated when he saw the May Queen and the room at large, and that this influenced his Beethoven frieze. I mean, yes, I was about to say, as soon as I saw it, the Opera of the Sea here, this does look a lot like Klimt's work, like The Woman in Gold, and very much like it is clearly influenced. The clearest evidence of MacDonald Mackintosh's influence, though, was that she and her architect husband, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, were invited back for a further commission at Fritz Werndorfer's Viennese villa in 1902 to adorn the piano. In his music room, she created a pair of shimmering inlaid gesso panels, the Opera of the Wind and the Opera of the Sea. Oh yeah, there we go. The Opera of the Sea bears striking similarities with Klimt's famous The Kiss, made 5 years later. Klimt would have seen these works, and yet has MacDonald Mackintosh's name ever been mentioned in relationship to Klimt? I mean, I don't know if we could even use the word influence. Ripped off is almost closer. And recognition for their art didn't sustain the Four, because despite successfully exhibiting internationally, within a couple of years they stopped working as a group. So, known for her melancholic, mystical watercolours of women, Frances continued to exhibit widely, but much isn't known about her art on or after 1912. Up until then, her work had explored tensions and relationships, but our lack of knowledge about her later years is due in part to McNair, whose own artistic career faded and destroyed much of Frances's work following her death, which was a suspected suicide in 1920. Jealous husband. And Margaret's career continued to thrive in the early 1900s, collaborating with her husband, who wrote to her, "You are half, if not 3/4, in all my architectural work," and producing meticulous gesso panels for his buildings, and no doubt a whole lot more. She also carried on working in other media, such as watercolours, but after 1909, suffering from poor health, she produced very little. So despite the lack of attention the Glasgow School has afforded in art museums and books today, Glasgow's impact on European art was vast, propelling a new creativity, a modern identity, emerging artistic forms. The MacDonald sisters were central to the development of the avant-garde. But in the wake of the First World War, the rise of post-impressionism in Britain and of the Bauhaus in Germany, the Glasgow style declined in popularity, eventually falling out of favour. So that brings us to the end of this second part of The Story of Art Without Men by Katie Hessel. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to having you with me for more art history without men in part 3. But until then,